In this slide deck, I'm going to discuss group policy. So previously I discussed Active Directory accounts and users, computers, and OUs. And now we'll talk about group policy, which is how we enforce IT security policy. And really when we talk about group policy, this is basically how we define what users can and cannot do based on where they are, what computer they're using, what their roles are, and so forth and so on. Group policy is all about the enforcement of IT security policy, and that's probably the most important takeaway from this presentation. As I go through this presentation, keep that in mind. Think about your an IT security policy and all of the things that you can use group policy to enforce from an IT security policy. It's one thing to have policies that tell users they can and cannot do certain things, but that doesn't ensure that those things are not going to happen. So having technical controls in place is obviously a much better method of enforcing those policies. And the two main types of technical controls that we have in most organizations are going to be firewalls and proxy servers, and then group policy and Active Directory. So those are kind of the two main tools that we have to enforce those policies. So again, try to keep in mind how these are used throughout the presentation. In this slide deck, I'm going to talk about the group policy architecture. So the architecture of the group policy itself. So it has the following components. GPOs are an object that contains policy settings that affect user and computer operating environments and security. And then you have replication, which is how group policy is applied to the computers across the network and how it's replicated. And scope and inheritance, which is group policy can be nested because it applies to many different types of objects. One of the things that we have to be aware of is how those settings are applied when there are different settings at different levels. For example, you might have one setting that is applied to an entire organizational unit and a different setting that might be applied to a specific user. And it's important to understand how those are actually going to get applied so you understand that architecture and you know can design your group policy with that in mind. And then creating and linking, which is how they're created in the group policy management console and can be linked to one or more AD containers. In other words, when you create a group policy, you have to link it to some object in Active Directory, which would be a user account, a group, an OU, and so forth and so on. So you create the group policy and then you link it to an Active Directory object. So group policy contains policy settings for managing many aspects of domain controllers. So there's lots of different settings available to us in group policy, but there are two main types of group policies. There's local and domain GPOs. So a local GPO is really available outside of Active Directory. Every Windows computer, whether it's server or workstation, has a local GPO. So if you run gpedit.msc on any Windows computer, it'll bring up the group policy editor, and you can change security policy settings on a Windows workstation. For example, if you want to make sure that your computer doesn't auto-run whenever you put a CD-ROM in, you could go in the group policy editor and you can turn that setting off. A lot of those settings you could also just set in the registry as well, but group policy is, probably the better way to do that. But local GPOs, again, are only on the local workstation. These are not part of Active Directory. And even if you're on Active Directory, you could still go into your local GPO and make changes to your group policy. There are limited settings, however, in the local GPO. And they apply differently depending on who's logging in. So if you log in as an administrator, you have a set of GPOs, then you have a GPO for non-administrators, and then user-specific. So you can set GPOs to specific users. So to access these GPOs, you add the group policy object editor snap-in to the MMC, or you can just run the gpedit command as I described before, and then you'll be able to go through and manage the group policies. Now, domain group policies, on the other hand, or domain GPOs, these are handled in Active Directory. One thing I should mention is that domain GPOs have far more settings and far more capability than local GPOs. So local GPOs have a very small subset of the settings that are available when you're using Active Directory. So there's a lot more flexibility and a lot more capability when you're using domain GPOs. And there are two separate parts. You have the GPT, which is the group policy template, and the GPC, which is group policy container. They have some common traits: the naming structure and folder structure. And the GPO structure is important for resolving issues. In other words, understanding how these work together. So a group policy template has all the policy settings that make up a GPO, as well as related files, scripts, and is contained in the sysvol share in a domain controller, and this is what gets replicated. So this is basically where all of the group policy settings are stored. So upon creation of group policy, there are a couple files that will get created in the GPT folder. You have the gpt.ini, machine, and user that get created. We'll talk more about these files here in a little bit when we look at group policy settings. So a group policy container is stored in the system policies folder, and it contains GPO properties and status information, but no actual policy settings. So it has the status and properties of the group policy, but not the actual policy settings, which are going to be in the group policy template. So the template has the actual settings, and the group policy container has the properties and status information. So you'll find in the GPC the name of the GPO, the file path to the group policy template, the version, and the status of that GPO. So, and here's the screen where you can look at the attributes of a group policy container. All right, so replication is important because when we make these settings, we want to make sure that they replicate to all of the computers in the network. So no matter where a user is or logs in, their correct restrictions and policies are applied to their account, and they are replicated with Active Directory. So we talked a little bit about in the last slide deck. I talked a little bit about how replication works for user accounts, computers, OUs, and all of those sorts of things. Group policies are replicated through the same structure. So they use the same concept of a distributed database to replicate these settings. They could be replicated using file replication or FRS, file replication services. And this is when you're running a mixed environment of different versions of the Windows operating system. But if you're running all of the same version of the operating system, so for example, if they're all Windows Server 2012 R2, then it can use Distributed File System Replicator or DFSR. I believe DFSR also works if it's mixed 2008 and 2012. I don't think it has to be, I think you just can't be any older than 2008. But DFSR is much more efficient and reliable, so it's the preferred method. But again, if you're running at a functional level below 2008, then it'll fall back to file replication service. So one of the problems with group policies is that as you're making changes to group policy, there's so many little settings in there, that have to be tracked that they can become corrupt or out of sync across the network. So there's a tool that you can use. The GPO tool can help you diagnose those problems and synchronize the group policy settings across the network. So once you create a group policy, as I said before, you have to link those policies to Active Directory objects. So the primary tools for creating and editing GPOs are the Group Policy Management Console, or GPMC, and the Group Policy Management Editor, or GPME. So if you're editing a group policy that is already linked to a container, changes in policy settings take effect as soon as the clients download them. Before introducing multiple and by the way, there's no save option in GPME. Every time you make a change, it gets saved immediately, so you don't actually have to save it. Kind of like working with a database. Same sort of concept. So if you want to edit an existing GPO, you're going to right-click on the GPO in the GPMC and click Edit, which opens the GPME, which is the editor. So again, you go in GPMC, it'll be a tree structure. You right-click, you're going to edit, and then you'll be in the editor, and you can make changes to various policies. You could make changes to the default domain policy, but it's probably not a good idea to do that. You should create new policies and link the new policies to your user accounts, or to your objects rather, not user accounts. Very rare that we actually make group policy to specific users. It's usually to other objects. So here's an example of what it looks like. So this is the group policy management, and if I were to right-click on one of these, I could edit one of these policies. So there's two ways to create a new policy, and this is where we're going to start talking about GPTs. So you're going to right-click the container where you're linking the GPO and select Create GPO in this domain and link it here. Or you can go to the Group Policy Objects folder and create a new one directly in Group Policy. In other words, you can create the new group policy right from the object in Active Directory that you want to link it to, or you can create a new policy and then link it from where you create the new policy. The best practice is to create GPOs that focus on a category of settings and then name the GPO accordingly. In other words, have a policy for different categories of settings as opposed to individual containers. In other words, instead of saying, okay, I'm going to make a group policy for my accounting OU, instead think about some of the types of policies that you have and how they would be set, and instead name them that way and then link them to the appropriate. You may find that you have groups of settings that apply globally to many different types of objects. For example, there might be a policy that applies to everyone except for two departments. So you could use that same GPO and link it to all of those different objects. A starter GPO is basically a GPO. It's sort of like a wizard that you can use to create GPOs that has the common settings already configured. So you can use a starter GPO to create a new group policy, or you can create one without a starter GPO, but generally you'll use a starter GPO when you're creating new group policies. The scope of a group policy defines which objects in AD are affected by the settings in the policy. So if two GPOs are applied to an object, and a setting is configured on one GPO but not the other, the configured setting is applied. In other words, when you're in GPO, sometimes there'll be three things. There'll be either to set, or not specified. And if it's not specified, that means that it will not override somebody else's setting or another GPO setting. Frequently what happens is you create GPOs that will have similar settings, and there's an inheritance in scope that happens where if one GPO has a certain setting configured and another GPO has it configured a different way, they'll override one another. Well, one of them will override the other, depending on where it's set and how the nesting is configured. It can get very complicated, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But if you leave it unspecified, it will not apply, it will not overwrite that particular user. So this is the order that they're actually applied. So when you log into a computer, well, I should start with turning on the computer. When you turn on a computer and it's joined to a domain, first it's going to get computer level policies and apply those. And then when the user logs in, all of the policies that apply to objects associated with that user, for example, their OU, their site, their groups, and so forth. So the order that GPOs are applied is the local policies are applied first, then the site-linked GPOs, then domain-linked, and then OU-linked. So we start with the local policies that are, in other words, I talked about how we have local GPOs, which are only on the local workstation. They're not part of the domain. A user could go in there and configure anything they want, but then when the site-linked GPOs are applied, those will overwrite local. And then when domain-linked GPOs are applied, they overwrite the site-linked. And then when the OU-linked GPOs are applied, they're going to override the domain and the site and the local. So that means if you put a setting in an OU GPO, it is going to override anything in the domain or site-linked GPOs. Now, thinking about that, the reason we have this hierarchy is you might have certain settings that should only apply to mobile users, for example. So that would be a site. And then you might have a domain. So if a site linked could be global across all of the, in the entire forest. And then a domain might have some specific policies, and then the OU might have some very specific policies. So that's how you want to think about how you're going to apply your group policies. Think about things, maybe think about sites first, and then think about your domains, and then think about OUs, and try to frame it in what settings are going to override other settings. Because this can be one of the challenging things about GPOs. It's hard to keep track of how these are being applied, because not only do you have these policies being applied in this order, but within those you might have nesting within each of these. So there could be nested OUs, for example, and nested sites and so forth that might be applying different policies. So the last policy applied takes precedence over any policies that were applied earlier, unless you have unspecified for a particular policy, so it doesn't override. So GPOs linked to a site affect all users and computers physically located at that particular site. They can be used for different policies for mobile users, for example, as I talked about. And then domain-linked GPOs are for domains, obviously. And then we have our OU-linked GPOs, which can be for fine-tuning of group policies at the OU level. And they are applied last. So obviously those are going to be our most granular settings at the OU level. And remember, they can also be nested, which can make this even more complicated. So if you want to change the default GPO inheritance, right? So if you want to change the inheritance behavior, you can do that somewhat, although it's, again, this stuff can get rather confusing. But you can use blocking inheritance, you can enforce inheritance, and you can use GPO filtering, which is sort of like setting up an umbrella where settings kind of filter around a particular setting. So with blocking, with blocking GPO inheritance, it prevents GPOs linked to parent containers from affecting children. So you would have to do that in the parent. So in the parent, you can make sure that a setting does not get inherited by its children in the parent. So that's one way you could do this. It should be used sparingly because typically you want those settings to filter down to the children. It's unusual that you want a setting to apply only to the parent, not to its children. But there are certainly cases, I suppose, where this can happen. Oh, and if you see here the last point here, blocking usually implies a flawed OU design. In other words, a lot of times we're using blocking GPO inheritance in order to fix some inherent design flaw in how we designed our group policies. So enforcing GPO inheritance overrides conflicting configurations at a deeper level. So if multiple GPOs are enforced, the GPO at the highest level is enforced in a conflict. But if a GPO is linked in an OU and a GPO linked to a domain are both set to enforce, the GPO linked to the domain has stronger precedence. In other words, if you have an OU and a domain, normally the OU GPO would override a domain GPO. But if they are set to enforced, then the opposite is going to be true. Then the domain will have stronger precedence over the OU. Again, this is another one of those things that if we're doing this, there's probably something inherently wrong with how we're structuring our policies. And finally, GPO filtering is the method that we use to alter the normal scope of a GPO and exclude objects from being affected by its settings. So there's two types of GPO filtering. You have security filtering and Windows Management Instrumentation, or WMI filtering. And this is what the dialog looks like when you're doing filtering. Filtering can get somewhat complicated, but basically it uses the WMI language. So WMI is sort of a query language used with Windows management. It's not really taught in this course, but it's certainly something that you can learn about. But basically it's sort of a query language for Active Directory, more or less. So you can certainly learn that, but most things that we do with Active Directory we can do with the UI, of course, as you probably have noticed in the labs. All right, so in the next slide deck, I'm going to start talking about group policy settings.